right, Keith. So here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Keith Kurlander. Keith, welcome.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Awesome. So Keith is the co-founder of the Integrative Psychiatry Institute, the industry leader in psychedelic-assisted therapy training. He's also a psychotherapist, a coach, co-founder of the Integrative Psychiatry Centers, as well as co-host of the Higher Practice podcast. And he previously founded and ran the Higher Practice business that helped therapists grow their practices. Keith, welcome once again. Before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Well, I grew up in central New Jersey, so East Coast. And then, I left there when I was 18, 17, and I'm in my late 40s. So I've been around, but I've been in Colorado for the last 20 plus years.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm originally from the East Coast as well, too, and
Okay.
moved around.
Yeah.
All right. So fascinating here. How did all this start for you?
It's a personal and professional journey that led me here. Personally, I had a lot of complex PTSD as a kid that I didn't know about what it was. And in my late teens, early 20s, I started developing a lot of serious mental health symptoms and got pretty sick. And 25 years ago, even longer, there wasn't a ton of conversation in the mental health field about trauma as a process. There was sort of PTSD, but it was reserved for like very serious events that have happened to people. And so nobody ever thought of bringing up even the term trauma to me. And so, I went on a roundabout way, but I also was very spiritually minded and also interested in helping other people because I was not doing well. So I ended up becoming a psychotherapist. And that started my professional journey into psychotherapy. And then there was a long road of different things. And I had dabbled with psychedelics from a healing perspective early on. Nothing crazy, not like doing it every day or anything, but, I was looking for answers. And long story short, eventually 6 years ago, I moved out of the individual private practice world and realized I wanted to, I co-founded a couple companies to try and get education out to the masses and to educate mental health providers on a broader way of looking at mental health disorders and root causes. And then we opened, a continuing medical education company essentially to do that. So, and then I'm here. So there's a lot of winding parts in there, but that's the overview.
But really interesting. So when you said, I think you said you moved out when you were 18, when you were in the midst of this as a young kid, were you cognizant of what was going on in terms of the symptoms you were experiencing and what they were caused by?
No, I mean, as a young kid, my symptoms looked like severe social anxiety, and anxiety, I would say, just anxiety. But then they started exacerbating in my late teens, early 20s. And I did a psilocybin journey for the first time. And that really spun me out. And I didn't know why. And nobody had good answers for me.
Spun you out, meaning what?
I mean, my symptoms got a lot worse. I started having, more of a mixed symptoms of depression and anxiety, and a lot of overwhelm and intrusive thoughts. And, now when I would start listing these symptoms, we would start thinking about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was like bipolar was really the best thing they could think about without thinking like, could this be trauma and not bipolar? And then, things kind of fluctuated in my 20s looking for answers. And then it was in my 30s when I discovered that this was really due to trauma from childhood and complex trauma. It wasn't like specific event trauma. I wasn't physically abused or anything. It was very complex trauma and intergenerational trauma. I'm Jewish. And, I did a lot of work there.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of that going around, complex trauma. There's a lot of complex trauma going around in the world.
Yeah, yeah. So at some point you decide to pursue becoming a therapist. You founded companies. At a particular time, did you work with a therapist?
Yeah, I mean, I've done hundreds of
Okay, you've done
hours
it
as a
all.
client.
Okay,
I did that. I was also very deeply involved in my 20s in more of like the spiritual stuff, like yoga and meditation and things, trying to use that path to work with
okay,
myself. So I've done all kinds of things.
okay.
And things have helped, things have helped. And I also found that psychedelics helped me, but what they did was they really amplified my trauma. They didn't to get rid of it. They kind of shone a light on it, and we can talk more about that.
Hmm.
And uh, and eventually, like, it was a lot of different work. It was trauma therapies, somatic-based trauma therapies like somatic experiencing, and a lot of physical things I had to do for my body. Often a lot of systems in the body get dysregulated when you're very traumatized. You're got brain access, your hormonal systems. There's a lot of repair you have to do. Typically, if you've had long-term enduring trauma in your body.
Right, right.
So I had to do that stuff too.
So, damn, a lot of work you did.
Yeah, a lot of work.
Now, what talk to us about the journey of founding Integrative Psychiatry Institute.
So I'd say 10 or 12 years ago, maybe, I don't remember the exact time, I started wanting to branch out from individual work with people. And at first I started the higher practice business, which was like helping therapists get more empowered to build practices and get the types of clients they want. And, that was sort of my first taste at something of a larger scale business than a solo practice.
Hmm.
But then about 6 years ago, I was getting more and more dissatisfied with what I was seeing in mental health care at large. Um, Seeing the numbers over the last 2 decades of mental illness, just rising and rising. And now you see what's happening in teens. When you look at those numbers, it's pretty scary. And my dear friend and I, he's a psychiatrist. We sort of at the same moment were like, we need to start something bigger here. We need to reach other providers so that they're working with people differently, so they have a much broader knowledge base of all the different things that are causing mental health issues. Typically, providers are taught in a very siloed fashion about what's causing a mental health issue, and that's what
Hmm.
they know. Whether it's a therapist or a doctor, it doesn't matter. They're siloed into what they know of what they were taught. So we came in with an integrative educational model. It's called the Integrative Psychiatry Institute. We started with doctors. We started in the field of psychiatry to educate mostly psychiatrists and nurse practitioners around integrative frameworks and trauma. But we had always had our eye on, we knew we were going to get into psychedelic therapy when the time was right. And we did a few years ago. And that's really what we're focused on now. We're really focused on psychedelic therapy because we believe it's just the next wave of a tool that's really going to help a ton of people in the world.
Hmm.
It's not a panacea, but it's one of the great tools we're going to have in our lifetime. There'll be others in the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
future.
Now, integrative. Talk to our listeners about what exactly that means.
It means different things, but depending on who you're talking to. What it means in our world, so the concept of integrative medicine is really where that term comes from. Integrative medicine is a little different than like alternative medicine. A lot of people have heard that term.
Hmm.
Um, Integrative medicine is really about bringing different fields together, and really working with different aspects of the human condition, and not staying only in like a reductionistic view of medical science. It's still a medical based field, but we try and look at other things, and that's going to include lifestyle medicine. It's going to include understanding natural remedies like they do in alternative medicine, like supplements and things. It's going to include having a much broader understanding of the root causes in your nervous system, which is trauma, to mental health conditions, which is still greatly underappreciated in the education of mental health care providers. So integrative is really spanning out the root causes of
Okay.
what mental health conditions are from. So it's a much wider span of root causes so that a provider can, work with, or a client can come to an integrative practitioner that's going to have a much wider view. Well, where does this come from?
Right.
And then trauma tends to be one of the most common themes across all mental health conditions. Trauma is a process. Okay. So I don't know how much you've talked about this in this podcast, but there's trauma as a disorder, which is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Well,
And that's a
this
list
is the
of,
Trauma Therapist podcast. This
yeah.
is
So
always
you've talked,
about.
yeah. So you've talked about it. So
Right.
trauma as a process is what's the disorder is not what's across all mental health disorders. So that's a list of symptoms. What's across all mental health disorders is the process. So that's what we're focused on.
Okay. So in terms of psychedelics and what you provide in terms of training, when you say you're getting the psychedelics, what does that mean specifically? Because it can mean many different things, correct?
Sure. Yeah, it can. Well, right now there's three main medicines to think about in psychedelic therapy. That's ketamine, MDMA, and psilocybin. And there's different legal things to discuss here about each one. But in terms of what will hopefully be used in the near future is MDMA, we hope, but we don't know. There's an approval process happening right now that could get denied or approved by this end of this summer. In terms of psilocybin, you see state-led initiatives now where that's already happening in Oregon, and it's about to happen in Colorado, coming to the field by next year. In Colorado, you'll see psilocybin therapy. And then ketamine therapy is happening. That's legal for providers to do, because ketamine is a Schedule III substance used in medical cases already. It's been used for decades. So psychedelic therapy, when we say that, we're talking typically about these three medicines. And it's the pairing of using a medicine during a therapy session that allows for a very different process. It's an altered state of consciousness. So it can typically, it amplifies things inside of us. It turns the volume up typically, not always, on something inside of us. And that can be a trauma process that it amplifies, that then we work with in the session. It can be other things, but people can gain really deep insights about themselves that they weren't aware of. They can revisit childhood memories. There's a whole gamut of things that happen in psychedelic therapy.
So I think one of the questions would be when, for example, you said you've experienced a lot of it, a lot of these, or some.
Yeah, enough. I'll say
Okay,
enough.
enough.
Yeah.
So,
They're not actually a big part of my life anymore, just to
okay,
be clear.
but
But I had.
to give our listeners a specific idea of who might this be useful for? Someone coming in with interpersonal trauma, or someone coming in, or any type of trauma. When would this be utilized?
So it depends on the medicine,
Okay.
because the medicines are going to have different indications. The primary medicine being researched for trauma is MDMA. Now that's PTSD. We're not talking about trauma as a process. We're talking about coming with that syndrome, PTSD, treatment resistance, you've tried other things, MDMA is heavily researched now on that. Now, whether the FDA agrees with the findings there, we're going to find out soon. The ketamine is pretty heavily researched on depression, treatment-resistant depression. And then psilocybin, which is a mushroom, is researched on treatment-resistant depression, and then some other more nuanced things like end-of-life distress, and some other things. And then there's some other smaller studies too, looking at anxiety with ketamine and this and that. So that's kind of the broad brush stroke. But just returning to what I said, all psychedelics can amplify trauma processes in us. And most people, in my opinion, a very high percentage of people with any mental health condition has a trauma process in their body.
When you say amplify a trauma process, what does that mean? Does that mean exacerbate it so that we can look at it more clearly, or what? What do you mean when you say amplify a trauma process?
It might mean turning the volume up on the somatic representation, the physical representation of the trauma in the body, sensations that are associated with the traumatic process, and that could be pain, that can be discomfort, agitation, different things that people who have trauma feel. So it could be somatic, it could be memories, it could be direct memories of traumatic events that have happened.
And this is a good thing because it then could be worked with in that moment.
This is usually a good thing.
Okay.
This is usually a good thing. Some people, it might be too fast for them to go that fast with the trauma process if they haven't done any other work. But it's usually a good thing because as great as trauma therapy can be, sometimes it takes years and it's slow and it's not moving the needle fast enough for people.
Right.
So it's usually a good thing. Is it always a good thing? No, nothing's always a good thing. Sometimes it's too fast or they haven't done enough groundwork, but typically these medicines do work really well overall, I would say.
So let me just remind everyone, I'm speaking with Keith Kurlander from the Integrative Psychiatry Institute. So let's talk about the programs you provide for professionals, mental health professionals. They can come to your website and find what specifically?
So we have a bunch of programs. The main program, since we're talking about psychedelic therapy, is our year-long psychedelic therapy training. It's one of the only programs that leads to a certification. It's probably the most robust program in terms of training hours available. It's in 260 hours roughly over the course of a year. It includes, if you do the full training, you're coming into 2 live practicums in person, where you're training with psilocybin and you're training with ketamine. It's weekly online for that whole year. So that's our main program that, we're really investing most of our time into right now. We've trained about 1,500 people at this point.
Wow.
That are certified. And so there's a lot of interest in getting trained right now because it's really like, the next modality wave. There's these modality waves that come, and this is a big one because we need something. We need more, obviously. We always need more here for helping people. People are suffering, as you know.
Well, that's an interesting point. And I think, thinking about people who are listening to this podcast, thinking to themselves, well, I've done this, I've done this training and I've done that training and I've done this workshop and I've done this modality and I've studied EMDR and somatic experiencing or whatever. What is it about psychedelics that is so intriguing? What angle is it coming at? What is it providing in terms of treatment that these other modalities aren't?
That's a good question. Is this in reference to the client or the therapist, this question?
Well, it's in reference to, I guess, the therapist, because I'm
Okay.
imagining there are a lot of people thinking who aren't familiar with why should I study this?
Hmm.
What is this going to give me?
Hmm.
And in turn, give the client.
What is it going to give you? Well, first of all, it's not for everyone. I would start saying that. You have to want to be with the, intensity in people, like, very high levels sometimes. Sometimes it's mellow and sweet and super like warm and fuzzy, but you're going to get the opposite of that coin too. And you're really wanting to be in like this. It's a therapist that's like wanting to help people in their most, deepest stuff inside of them and really get in there and wants to do the training to be able to sit with that because it's not, you have to know how to deal with that stuff. I mean, people might act out a little here and there in ordinary therapy. That happens. But people will act out more than here and there in non-ordinary therapy because they're under the influence of a medicine. They're going to say things that you're like, whoa, in ordinary therapy, you're like, that's not okay in here. You can't ever
Mm-hmm,
say that,
mm-hmm.
And that's different. So it's an extremely dynamic form of therapy. There's so much going on there. And sometimes you're sitting in silence for hours. Someone's very internal, and you have to be able to do that and not get in the way of the process. So it's super dynamic, it's creative, it's interesting beyond belief, and it's delicate. And you need a lot of training. You really have to understand the ethics really well. You have to know yourself really well. Because you're working with people are under the influence of powerful substances. And so you really have to know yourself well, and the whole world of countertransference and all that. It's like the next level because you got people doing things a little stronger than usual.
Right.
Um, so it's an it's great. I mean, it's in terms of like preventing burnout. It's so interesting, right? And I think in the end though, it's very possible you may be able to help some people you would have never been able to help. And that's what it comes down to for me. Like there are certain people they just need something different.
I've interviewed a few representatives from different psychedelic therapy organizations on this podcast, and you've explained it in a way that I don't think anyone else has, and you've articulated the nuances of it, and in a way that I can really appreciate what it's about and how dynamic and creative and complex it is. Because what you said, people are going to be experiencing things in a way that they don't in a normal therapeutic setting. But at the same time, that's almost going to demand more from you as a therapist. You've got to know your own SHIT. Let me ask you, what have you learned in terms of about yourself in terms of doing this type of work? How has this challenged you?
Well, I mean, I have to be more poised, less less reactive, um, more attuned, higher levels of attunement, um, more empathy. It's just like turning the dial up on everything
Mm,
for myself. It shows me all the places where I'm not attuned, where I'm not empathic, where I'm not compassionate, where I'm scared, which is fine. All the places in me that I'm scared of human suffering, of human acting out. It shows me all of those places. And it's I'm running a company now. I'm not sitting with people right now. But I've been around a lot at this point, and this work shows me just again, all the places inside myself that constantly need help and healing, and in order to be able to sit with a person's places in themselves that need that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, So you said these trainings aren't for everyone, but who are they for?
Well, there seem to be increasingly for a lot of people is what we're seeing. But I'm saying they're not for everyone because not everybody, there are certain types of workers out there that are, you know, their healing modality is just different. It's not depth oriented. They're let's say they're just like super. I'm a cognitive behavioral person. I love it. I love working with like thoughts and moods in this sort of engineering way. It might not be for them, right? If that's just like they're very fixed on
Sure.
that. Um, but I think generally speaking, in the therapy space, it's for a lot of people that want to go down this road, but it's you're taking on an investment of time and energy and money and also self-growth because
Mhm.
you're going to be inviting more into your office than you have before. That's an exciting thing for most therapists, honestly. That's what most therapists live for is more growth.
Yeah, yeah.
But not everyone's on that road, and that's okay. Um, and also it's just not for everybody. Like not everybody wants that extra level of unpredictability in their workspace, in their career. And that's okay. It's not for everybody in that way.
All right, Keith. How do people learn more about these training programs? What's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Best way to check out this program is to go to psychiatryinstitute.com/apply. So that'll
Okay.
take you directly to this program, psychiatryinstitute.com/apply. And
Okay.
and from there they can see a lot of other programs too.
All right. And I'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Uh, awesome, man. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing not just your experience, but the nuanced, textured excitement that's happening with all these different types of therapies. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right, man. Take care.
Thanks.